Somewhere in the mists of Roman Britain, an entire legion, 5,000 trained soldiers, vanished without leaving a trace. No battlefield remains, no written account, no final orders. One day, they were stationed in York. After that, nothing. What happened to the 9th Legion? Why did the Empire remain silent? And why have historians struggled for centuries to find even the faintest shadow of their fate? This is not just a mystery of ancient warfare. It's a silence woven deep into the fabric of history. Let's begin to examine the stones, the scrolls, and the whispers left behind in the search for a legion that disappeared without a word. The last recorded march, York, AD 108. In the early 2nd century, the Roman Empire maintained its northern frontier in Britain through a network of military forts, roads, and garrisons. One of the most important of these was Eboracum, the Roman fortress at what is now York. Established around AD 71 by the 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, it served as the legion's headquarters and a strategic stronghold for nearly 4 decades. The legion had fought in earlier campaigns under Agricola and had participated in the suppression of Boudicca's revolt. It maintained order in northern Britain, built infrastructure, and enforced Roman authority beyond the River Humber. Yet by AD 108, all traces of the 9th Legion vanish from official records, and the reason remains unknown. The final mention of the 9th Legion in Britain comes from a building inscription discovered in York, catalogued as RIB 665. The stone dates to between AD 104 and 108 and records the legion's involvement in constructing part of the fortress complex. After that, no new inscriptions, documents, or military diplomata referencing the 9th in Britain have been found. The absence is not explained in any surviving Roman source. The legion, which had existed for more than a century, simply disappears. This kind of disappearance is unusual in Roman military history. The legions were heavily tracked and documented across the empire. Their movements, victories, losses, and internal honors were recorded in inscriptions, dispatches, and veteran discharge papers. When legions were destroyed in battle, such as those lost in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9, the events were documented by multiple sources. Rome mourned, retaliated, and commemorated its fallen. In the case of the 9th, there is no similar acknowledgement. No battle is named, no commander is blamed, and no memorial is erected. At the time of its last mention, Britain remained an unstable province. The region north of Eboracum was never fully subdued. Tribal groups such as the Caledoni, Selgovae, and Novante continued to resist Roman rule. Small uprisings and attacks on Roman outposts were common. The 9th Legion had long been responsible for patrolling and securing the frontier. If it had suffered a significant loss in combat, especially in Britain, the event would typically have generated a written or archaeological trace. No such trace has ever been confirmed. One theory is that the 9th was destroyed during a failed northern campaign. Such an outcome could explain the sudden disappearance and the lack of discharge diplomas after AD 108. Roman soldiers who survived their service typically received a diplomata, an official certificate granting Roman citizenship and retirement rights. Many have been recovered from Britain and across the empire, listing the names of the issuing legions. For the 9th, no known diplomata dated later than 108 has ever been found. If the legion was wiped out before soldiers could retire, that could explain the absence of records. Another theory is that the 9th was transferred out of Britain and later disbanded elsewhere. Some early scholars believed inscriptions in Nijmegen, in the modern Netherlands, and in Syria might have indicated the 9th's presence in those provinces after 108. But most modern historians no longer accept these as reliable. The inscriptions either date earlier or refer to different units. There is no definitive post-108 evidence showing the 9th operating under its original name anywhere else in the Roman Empire. The arrival of a new legion in Britain, Legio VI Victrix, adds another layer to the mystery. This legion was transferred from Lower Germany and appears in Britain around 122 AD, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. It took over the fortress at York, previously occupied by the 9th. The replacement was complete, Legio VI Victrix became the dominant Roman military presence in northern Britain for the next 2 centuries. There was no overlap, no joint occupation, and no indication of a gradual transition. This suggests that the Ninth was no longer functional as a unit by the time the Sixth arrived. Excavations at York have not revealed any destruction layer corresponding to a battle or siege. The fortress shows signs of continuous use and later modification, with tiles and stamped bricks from the 6th Legion appearing in later layers. Artifacts from the 9th diminish sharply after the early 2nd century. Their absence supports the idea that the Legion left or was removed from York entirely sometime shortly after AD 108. Roman historians of the time, including Tacitus and Suetonius, do not mention the Legion's disappearance. Tacitus, who had served in Britain and written extensively about the province, had both the experience and opportunity to record such an event. Yet in his surviving texts, there is no reference to the loss of a full legion in northern Britain. Whether this was due to lost manuscripts, imperial censorship, or deliberate omission is not known. Hadrian's later visit to Britain in 122 AD, and his order to construct a massive stone wall across the island's northern frontier, occurred just 14 years after the Ninth's last record. Though the emperor never cited a reason for the wall, the timing suggests that something significant may have occurred in the years prior, perhaps even involving the Ninth. Still, no written source makes that connection directly. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion remains one of the most notable gaps in the Roman military record. No final posting is recorded. No reorganization under a new name has been confirmed. No veteran testimonies survive. Only a stone in York, placed by soldiers engaged in construction, remains as their last verified act. After that, the Ninth, present for over 60 years in Britain, ceases to appear. The Roman wall that followed. Hadrian's response. In 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain during a wider tour of the empire's frontiers. Unlike earlier emperors, Hadrian was not focused on expansion. His policies favored consolidation and control. Soon after his arrival in the province, he gave orders to construct a continuous fortification across northern Britain. This structure, later known as Hadrian's Wall, marked a significant change in imperial strategy and appeared just years after the last known activity of the Ninth Legion. Hadrian's Wall stretched about 73 Roman miles, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. It ran across the narrowest part of Britain, using a mix of stone and turf depending on the terrain. Forts, mile castles, and watchtowers were placed at intervals to house soldiers and monitor traffic. The wall was more than a military defense, it also functioned as a customs checkpoint, controlling trade and the movement of people across the frontier. 3 legions carried out the construction: 2 Augusta, 20 Valeria Victrix, and 6 Victrix. The arrival of 6 Victrix was itself notable. This legion had not previously served in Britain. It was transferred from Germania Inferior around the time of Hadrian's visit and replaced the 9th Legion in the fortress at Eboracum, modern-day York. The replacement happened with no surviving explanation. Archaeological layers in York show a clear transition between the 9th and the 6th, but no evidence of overlap. The 9th Legion had last appeared in inscriptions between 104 and 108 AD. After that, no records confirm its presence. The reasons for its disappearance remain uncertain. Some scholars suggest it was destroyed in battle. Others believe it was transferred and later disbanded. Regardless of the cause, by the time Hadrian arrived in 122, the 9th was no longer stationed in Britain, and the 6th had taken its place. Hadrian's broader military policy helps explain the wall's construction. Elsewhere in the empire, he developed frontier systems known as limes, made up of roads, forts, and small outposts. In Britain, this concept was expanded into a single fortified line. Unlike other provinces, the British wall was built with large stone sections and a high degree of permanence. It showed a deliberate choice to fix the empire's northern boundary, rather than continue military campaigns into Caledonia. The wall passed through areas that had previously seen military conflict. North of the line were tribes like the Selgovae and the Votadini. South of it were Roman-controlled lands. The new wall provided a physical marker between those territories, Mile castles with gates allowed controlled passage, and supply roads behind the wall, such as the military way, supported rapid troop movement. Forts along the wall, including Housesteads and Bertiswald, housed garrisons drawn from auxiliary units across the empire. Although Hadrian's Wall is one of the most visible Roman monuments in Britain, contemporary Roman sources offer almost no detail about its construction. The Historia Augusta, written in the late 4th century, simply notes that Hadrian built a wall to separate the Romans from the barbarians. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, adds only a brief mention, without reference to any conflict or legionary loss. No surviving Roman writer links the wall directly to the fate of the 9th Legion. Despite the silence, the timing invites speculation. The 9th disappears shortly after 108. By 122, the 6th has arrived. That same year, Hadrian initiates one of the most ambitious engineering projects of his reign. No memorial to the 9th is known. No military dispatch explains their absence. The records are simply quiet, and in that silence, a new boundary rises. The wall was not designed to be impenetrable. It was scalable and included gates. Its strength lay in surveillance and regulation. Soldiers stationed along the wall could observe, question, and respond. The design of the fortifications allowed for localized response to threats, not the repulsion of large-scale invasions. The Roman military doctrine of the time did not favor static defense against massive attacks, but preferred flexibility and deterrence through presence. Auxiliary units along the wall came from many parts of the empire, including Gaul, Germany, and even North Africa. Their placement here reinforced the idea that Rome used its frontier provinces not only for defense, but also to display imperial reach. Inscriptions found at various sites along the wall mention units such as the first cohort of Tungrians and the Batavians. These soldiers lived, worked, and often retired in the province. The logistical challenge of building the wall was considerable. Supplies of stone, wood, and lime had to be sourced locally. Civilian settlements developed near the larger forts to support the troops. Over time, these communities grew into permanent towns. The infrastructure created by the wall shaped the economic and social geography of the North for centuries. Roman records don't confirm a direct link between the wall and a specific military defeat, but the disappearance of a legion, sudden garrison changes, and major construction suggest the frontier was unstable. Whether to prevent another loss or replace a symbol of Roman strength, the wall marked the end of Roman expansion in Britain. Hadrian's decision to halt northern conquest set the boundary for Roman Britain for nearly 3 centuries. Though later emperors, like Antoninus, built briefly beyond it, Hadrian's Wall remained the defining line. No official account confirms its connection to a lost legion, but the structure itself may stand as the silent response to a disaster Rome chose not to record. What Tacitus didn't say. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, the Roman senator and historian, had direct access to sources unavailable to later chroniclers. He was born around 56 AD and rose through the ranks of Roman political life, eventually serving as consul in 97 and governor of the province of Asia around 112. He wrote extensively about the Roman Empire's politics and military campaigns. Yet in all his surviving works, there is no mention of the 9th Legion's disappearance, an absence that continues to puzzle scholars. Tacitus wrote Agricola, a biography of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, around 98 AD. Agricola had commanded Roman forces in Britain between 78 and 84 AD, and had led campaigns deep into the north, confronting the Caledonian tribes. The 9th Legion is named in this work, appearing as part of the Roman military structure in Britain during Agricola's campaigns. At that time, the 9th had already been in Britain for decades, having taken part in the initial invasion under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. In Agricola, Tacitus describes a failed assault on a Roman fort by northern tribes, where the 9th was nearly overrun before reinforcements arrived. He uses the event to highlight both the legion's vulnerability and its eventual recovery. That is the last secure literary mention of the 9th in Britain. In his later writings, Histories and Annals, Tacitus provides no account of what happened to the legion after that period. The final known epigraphic evidence of the Ninth Legion in Britain dates to somewhere between 104 and 108 AD. These inscriptions appear in York, known to the Romans as Eboracum, where the Ninth had been stationed for much of its history. Then, the record ends. By the time Hadrian arrived in 122, the Ninth was no longer there, and the Sixth Legion, VI Victrix, had replaced it. That change in garrison occurred without surviving explanation from the sources, and notably, without comment from Tacitus. The annals were written in the final years of Tacitus's life, and cover the history of the empire from the death of Augustus to that of Nero. However, the surviving manuscripts are incomplete. The period from 104 to 115 AD is missing entirely. That time frame overlaps with the disappearance of the Ninth Legion. If Tacitus did write about its fate, the relevant pages have not survived. Whether that content was lost through accident, neglect, or deliberate omission is unknown. Tacitus was not a historian who avoided discussing failure. He gave a detailed account of the Teutoburg forest disaster in 9 AD, where 3 Roman legions under Varus were annihilated by Germanic tribes. He used that event to criticize imperial overreach and emphasize the dangers of hubris. If the Ninth Legion had been destroyed in a similar event, it would be consistent with his style to include it, especially if it supported his broader themes about decline and moral weakness in the empire. Yet he says nothing. This silence has led to several theories. One possibility is that the Ninth Legion's disappearance was not due to a dramatic battle, but to administrative reassignment. If the legion had been transferred out of Britain and later disbanded or absorbed into another unit, Tacitus may have considered it unimportant or irrelevant to his primary themes. He may also have lacked full access to current records near the end of his life, especially after withdrawing from public office. Another explanation considers Tacitus's political motives. His writings often balance between criticism of emperors and admiration for older Roman virtues. If the disappearance of the Ninth reflected poorly on the ruling class or suggested weakness in the imperial system, he may have deliberately avoided it. Tacitus could be selective with his details, emphasizing moral decline over straightforward military reporting. The loss of a legion may have clashed with the narratives he wanted to present. Some historians argue that Tacitus never lived to write about the period in which the Ninth vanished. He likely died before 120 AD. If the legion disappeared shortly after 108, and before Hadrian's reorganization of the northern frontier, Tacitus may never have intended to cover that episode. The gaps in his annals were likely not intentional. They represent lost material, rather than omitted content. But with no other literary source stepping in to fill that void, the Ninth's fate remains undocumented. It is also possible that the disappearance was not publicly recorded because it was seen as an embarrassment. Rome did not always advertise its defeats. Mutinies, internal unrest, or quiet disbandments were often left out of official accounts. If the Ninth suffered attrition from desertion, insubordination, or logistical collapse, it might not have qualified for public notice. Roman authors, even critical ones, were cautious about exposing instability within the army. There is precedent for this kind of silence. The disappearance of Legio 22 Deotariana from Egypt in the 2nd century also lacks explanation. No battle, inscription, or chronicle describes its end. It simply stops appearing in records. This pattern, unexplained vanishing, is rare but not unique. Tacitus' silence about the Ninth may therefore reflect a broader cultural reluctance to document unresolved or inconvenient outcomes. Later Roman sources like Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta do not explain the fate of the Ninth Legion. Dio focused on Hadrian's policies, while the Historia Augusta only briefly mentions a wall built to separate Romans from northern tribes, without noting a lost legion. Modern scholars still search for clues in inscriptions or fragments. Yet Tacitus, who knew the key figures, had access to archives, and understood Britain's military structure, says nothing. Whether his writings were lost, censored, or unfinished, the result is the same. The Ninth Legion vanishes, and no clear explanation survives. Silent stones and missing graves. The Ninth Legion Hispana vanishes from the written record after AD 108. The final confirmed reference places the unit in Eboracum, modern-day York, stationed in Roman Britain's northern frontier. Beyond that date, no administrative documents, dispatches, or inscriptions name the 9th, but the written silence is only one part of the mystery. The archaeological record, often more reliable than surviving texts, is equally empty. For a legion that likely numbered between 5,000 and 6,000 men, and occupied a heavily fortified base for decades, the lack of physical traces after this point is difficult to explain. Archaeological work at York has revealed numerous Roman layers, including barracks, granaries, defensive walls, and bathhouses. Tile stamps bearing leg 9 hisp are common in layers dated to the 1st century and early 2nd century. These tile stamps serve as reliable evidence of a legion's presence, typically pressed into roof tiles, bricks, and drainage systems. After AD 108, however, the stamps cease. The later layers at York bear the mark of Legio VI Victrix, a legion transferred from Germany that would later become the dominant Roman force in northern Britain. The transition leaves no visible overlap. No shared building projects, no mixed tile deposits. The 9th disappears from York without a trace. Corbridge, a major Roman supply hub south of Hadrian's Wall, shows continued military activity in the decades following AD 108. Yet there are no tiles, altars, or gravestones linked to the 9th. The same is true for Lanchester and Binchester, two sites that remained active into the 2nd century. Evidence from these locations includes weapons, coins, tools, and inscriptions, but none of them identify the 9th. Auxiliary units are well represented. So are other legions, but the 9th is entirely absent. Roman legions often left funerary inscriptions, especially in dangerous or remote postings. Gravestones listed a soldier's name, age, years of service, rank, and unit. From earlier periods, several gravestones in York name soldiers of the 9th. These are standardized in format and found near the known military cemetery zones. After AD 108, however, no gravestones connected to the 9th have been recovered. Not for soldiers, not for officers. There are no dedications by comrades, no memorials erected by families, no funerary altars carved with leg 9 hisp. In known Roman military disasters, archaeological traces usually survive. The massacre of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9 is a key comparison. At Calcrease, researchers uncovered a battlefield filled with discarded weapons, coins, and human remains. There is no comparable layer in northern Britain. No burnt outposts, no hasty fortifications, no skeletons in mass graves dated to the early 2nd century. Trimontium, a Roman site near modern-day Melrose, was active around this period and has yielded a range of Roman military items, but it has not produced any inscription or artifact that links the site to the 9th. Several other forts in Scotland and northern England, Newstead, Inveresk, Camelon, show Roman military activity in the early 2nd century, often with substantial finds. Yet, in every case, the unit identities present exclude the 9th. There are inscriptions for cohorts, cavalry units, and even detachment forces, but none bearing the 9th's name. The absence is striking, because other legions posted to the same regions, such as the 20th Valeria Victrix and the 2nd Augusta, left behind significant amounts of stamped tiles, dedicatory inscriptions, and funerary monuments. A theory occasionally raised is that the 9th was transferred out of Britain and deployed elsewhere. Some tile fragments from Nijmegen in the Netherlands have been linked to the 9th, but the inscriptions are incomplete, and their dating remains uncertain. No accompanying gravestones, altars, or unit records in that area mention the 9th in clear terms. Roman legion transfers were major logistical operations. They often resulted in inscriptions marking the legion's arrival, sometimes tied to construction projects or temple dedications. These are missing in the case of the 9th. Another proposal is that the legion dissolved gradually due to attrition, desertion, or bureaucratic neglect. In such cases, however, some administrative trail usually remains. Papyri documenting supplies, transfer records, or even lists of discharged veterans tend to surface. Even if fragmentary, these offer hints of a legion's end. With the 9th, there are none. No partial rosters, no retirement notices, no scribal annotations. The records of similar units, some much smaller, have survived in desert fortresses and remote archives. The 9th left nothing. Preservation bias is not a sufficient explanation. Britain's soil has preserved countless inscriptions and military artifacts. The 20th Legion left behind tiles, wall carvings, and altars. The 2nd Augusta has funerary monuments and religious dedications. The 6th, which replaced the 9th in York, produced stamped tiles and building inscriptions soon after its arrival. The complete lack of such material for the 9th, after AD 108, is unusual. What is also missing are traces of high-ranking officers. Legates and tribunes often went on to serve in other provinces or were promoted to senatorial rank. Their careers are usually documented through tombstones or civic inscriptions. In the case of the 9th, no post-108 career paths of known officers have been confirmed. If they survived, they left no sign of their connection to the Legion. That silence is difficult to reconcile with typical Roman record-keeping and commemorative habits. Even religious dedications are missing. Roman soldiers often left altars to gods like Jupiter or Mithras, marked with their name and unit. Such inscriptions are common at bases like York, but none exist for the 9th after AD 108. The silence appears systematic. Graves, altars, and inscriptions expected to speak are completely absent. The Caledonian ambush theory. One of the most enduring explanations for the disappearance of the 9th Legion Hispana is the possibility that it was destroyed in a single catastrophic campaign in northern Britain. According to this theory, sometime after its last recorded presence in York, around AD 108, the Legion may have marched north into hostile territory and met its end in an ambush by Caledonian tribes. These tribes, described by Roman writers as fierce and independent, inhabited what is now Scotland. They had long resisted Roman expansion and were known for their use of rugged terrain to conduct guerrilla warfare. Their tactics, unlike the disciplined formations of the Roman legions, relied on swift attacks, ambushes, and retreat into difficult landscapes. Although no surviving Roman document explicitly records the destruction of the 9th in Britain, there are indirect indications that something significant occurred. One of the key circumstantial pieces of evidence comes from the construction of Hadrian's Wall, which began around AD 122. The wall was not only a fortification but also a major logistical project, stretching roughly 73 miles from the River Tyne to the Solway Firth. The timing has raised questions among historians. Why was such an enormous defensive measure implemented so soon after the last mention of the 9th? The wall has often been interpreted as a response to military instability in northern Britain, possibly a result of a devastating loss, such as the destruction of a legion. The terrain in northern Britain would have posed substantial challenges for a Roman legion. Dense forests, marshes, and rocky highlands made visibility and mobility difficult. These conditions favored the guerrilla-style tactics employed by Caledonian warriors, who could strike and retreat before Roman troops had time to organize a counterattack. A legion operating without sufficient support or cut off from its supply lines might have been overwhelmed in such conditions. The Roman historian Fronto, writing under Marcus Aurelius in the mid-2nd century, makes an ambiguous reference to many soldiers killed in Britain during the reign of Hadrian. While he does not identify the legion involved, the timing overlaps with the 9th's disappearance. This line, combined with the lack of any other known large-scale disaster in Britain during that period, has led some scholars to speculate that he may have been referring intentionally, or not, to the destruction of the 9th. The absence of tombstones or recovered legionary standards, the eagle symbols carried by each legion, is notable. In cases of major defeats, Romans often recovered, or at least commemorated, lost standards and officers. For example, after the defeat in the Teutoburg Forest in AD 9, Augustus initiated a campaign to retrieve the lost standards of the legions destroyed there. However, no such recovery effort or memorial has been recorded for the 9th. If the legion had been wiped out in hostile territory without survivors, there would have been no one to retrieve the standards or record the event in official documents. Further evidence lies in the silence of the archaeological record. There are Roman forts in northern Britain, like High Rochester and Risingham, that remained active during the early 2nd century. Yet none show clear signs of use by the 9th after AD 108. If the legion had been stationed or operated in those areas before its disappearance, we would expect to find inscriptions, tile stamps, or other material evidence. Their absence suggests the legion never returned from wherever it went. Caledonian resistance during this period was far from theoretical. The Roman governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who led campaigns into the north in the 82nd AD, faced organized and sometimes large-scale resistance. The Battle of Mons Graupius, fought around AD 83, was the last major engagement recorded by Tacitus in that region. While Agricola claimed victory, the Caledonians were not subdued, and Roman control remained limited. Over the next decades, intermittent conflict continued along the northern frontier, and Roman military policy began shifting from expansion to containment. In addition, the movement of Legio VI Victrix into York around AD 122 suggests a deliberate replacement rather than a simple reassignment. Roman legions were rarely transferred without documentation, and replacements usually came with administrative overlap or joint operations. In this case, there is no sign of transition between the 9th and the 6th, no joint inscriptions, no tombstones mentioning both units. This discontinuity could indicate that the 9th was no longer present, and that the 6th was sent to reoccupy the base after a loss. Oral traditions from Scotland, although fragmentary and often late in origin, contain scattered references to great battles against southern invaders. These accounts do not name Roman legions specifically, but they describe large conflicts in northern territories. While historians caution against reading too much into folklore, it is not unprecedented for oral memory to preserve distant echoes of real events, particularly when written history is silent. The Caledonian ambush theory remains speculative due to the absence of direct evidence, but its appeal lies in how it aligns with known Roman military patterns. Roman commanders did not tend to suppress records of victory, but they often underreported or concealed defeats, particularly when they involved losses that could damage imperial reputation. If the 9th was lost in a disastrous northern campaign, it would explain both the silence of Roman sources and the lack of physical remains. The location of such an ambush, if it occurred, remains uncertain, but its possibility casts a long shadow over the fate of the 9th Legion Hispana. The reassignment hypothesis. Among the theories surrounding the disappearance of the 9th Legion Hispana, the reassignment hypothesis proposes a quieter fate than battlefield annihilation. Rather than being destroyed in northern Britain, this theory suggests the legion was transferred elsewhere in the empire, possibly to a distant province such as Judea, Cappadocia, or Armenia, where it may have been absorbed into other military structures, suffered heavy losses, or quietly disbanded. This idea hinges on the known mobility of Roman legions and the administrative complexity of imperial logistics. Roman military records from the 2nd century reveal that legions were frequently moved across provinces in response to emerging threats or regional instability. It was not unusual for entire legions to be redeployed from one end of the empire to another, particularly during times of rebellion or external invasion. However, while many of these transfers were recorded in official documents, inscriptions, or tombstones, not all movements left behind a complete documentary trail. Gaps in the epigraphic and papyrological record are common, particularly in provinces with less archaeological recovery or in areas affected by later destruction. Proponents of the reassignment hypothesis point to a fragmentary inscription found in Nijmegen, in modern-day Netherlands. The stone, discovered in the early 20th century, includes the partially preserved mention of a legion ending in 9. Some scholars have interpreted this as a reference to the 9th Legion Hispana, potentially indicating its presence in the Rhine frontier region during the early 2nd century. However, the inscription is incomplete, and the reading is disputed. Alternative explanations suggest that the IX might refer to a different unit altogether, or be a misreading of another numeral. While intriguing, the Nijmegen inscription cannot, on its own, confirm the 9th's redeployment. A more detailed possibility arises when examining the situation in the eastern provinces. By the 122nd AD, Roman involvement in the eastern frontier intensified. Conflict with Parthia, unrest in Armenia, and the persistent instability in Judea presented logistical challenges and required reinforcements. If the ninth had been transferred to one of these regions, it would have entered a volatile theater of operations. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, which erupted in AD 132 and lasted until AD 136, involved heavy Roman military investment and resulted in massive casualties on both sides. Roman legions such as X Fretensis and VI Ferrata were active in the region, but other units, possibly including a redeployed ninth, may have participated without leaving behind records that survive. This silence in the documentation could reflect either the loss of physical records or a deliberate administrative choice. In the aftermath of a crushing defeat or particularly high casualties, the Roman state sometimes suppressed the public memory of a legion to preserve morale and political stability. This could involve quietly dissolving the unit, reassigning its survivors to other legions, and avoiding mention in official chronicles. Such suppression would not necessarily leave behind an epigraphic trace, especially in a region where local uprisings and later rebuilding efforts may have erased evidence. There are precedents for this kind of disappearance. Other Roman legions have vanished from the record with minimal explanation. Legio 22, Deotariana, for example, disappears from surviving documentation after the 2nd century, and is thought by some scholars to have been destroyed in the Bar Kokhba revolt, or during another Eastern conflict. Like the ninth, its fate remains uncertain, and it is not commemorated in surviving sources. These patterns suggest that the disappearance of a legion, while unusual, was not unprecedented, and may not have always been the result of a single cataclysmic event. The idea that the ninth was disbanded after reassignment is also supported by gaps in the tombstone record. Roman legions often left behind gravestones with detailed inscriptions naming the legion, the soldier's rank, origin, and sometimes the cause of death. After AD 108, tombstones for soldiers of the ninth ceased to appear, even in regions where the legion may have been sent. This absence may suggest that the unit no longer existed as a coherent entity, or that its remnants were absorbed into other formations. If soldiers from the ninth were folded into different legions, their later tombstones would reflect their new unit, erasing the ninth from memory by bureaucratic means. The lack of memorialization for officers of the ninth is particularly striking. Roman officers, especially centurions and tribunes, were often honored with inscriptions, statues, or dedications. If the ninth had simply been relocated, one might expect at least a handful of such records in its new station. The fact that none have been conclusively linked to the legion after its time in Britain complicates the reassignment theory, though it does not disprove it. Another potential explanation involves internal restructuring of the army. During the 2nd century, Rome occasionally reorganized its legions in response to imperial reforms. Some legions were renamed, merged, or split into vexellations, detached units serving independently from their parent legion. If the ninth was divided into smaller units and reassigned in this fashion, it may have ceased to exist under its original name, effectively vanishing from the official record, while its personnel continued to serve elsewhere. Evidence for such reorganizations is fragmentary, but not unknown. While the reassignment hypothesis does not offer a definitive answer, it presents a plausible and historically grounded alternative to theories involving battlefield destruction. It accounts for the absence of commemorative monuments, the silence of the written record, and the political utility of quietly dissolving a legion that had become inconvenient or embarrassing to remember. The mobility of Rome's military machine, combined with the known incompleteness of surviving evidence, leaves open the possibility that the ninth did not die in Britain, but rather disappeared along a dusty road in another troubled corner of the empire. The Damned Legion, Damnatio Memoriae. The Roman Empire had a method for erasing its own history. It was called Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This practice was used to systematically remove disgraced individuals from public record, whether emperors, senators, or high-ranking officials. Names were chiseled off inscriptions, statues were defaced, and official documents were revised. While traditionally applied to persons, the question arises whether a similar treatment could have been applied to an entire legion, specifically to Legio IX Hispana. No Roman source explicitly states that the Ninth Legion was subject to Damnatio Memoriae, But the idea persists among scholars because of the legion's sudden disappearance from records after AD 108. Its absence is peculiar. Roman legions were not anonymous. They left traces across provinces in tile stamps, inscriptions, funerary monuments, and dispatches. Yet after its last attested presence in Britain, likely in York, the ninth vanishes. This silence has prompted speculation that it was not merely lost, but deliberately erased. The first sign of this disappearance is its omission from documents where its presence would be expected. For example, the Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman document listing the military units of the empire, does not include the ninth. Though this document is from the early 5th century and the ninth had likely ceased to exist long before, it confirms that the legion was never reinstated or renamed, unlike others that were disbanded and then reconstituted. This absence of revival is unusual, especially if the legion had been destroyed in honorable service or reassigned. Another clue comes from the lack of official commemoration. Roman culture valued military honors. Even legions that had suffered defeats were often remembered, their banners recovered, their names honored in triumphs. The Teutoburg forest disaster in AD 9 saw the destruction of 3 legions, 17, 18, and 18, but those units were not reused, and their loss was openly acknowledged. In contrast, the ninth was not memorialized or avenged. No campaign was launched in its name. No standard was recovered. No official grief was recorded. This silence, some argue, is telling. The practice of erasure had strong political motivations. When emperors fell from grace like Domitian or Geta, their names were struck from monuments and their images destroyed. The intent was not just to punish, but to control narrative. To admit failure in the empire's military system, especially in a distant and challenging province like Britain, could reflect poorly on those in power. If the ninth suffered a humiliating defeat, or if the legion mutinied or disobeyed command, a decision could have been made to remove it entirely from the record rather than acknowledge the failure. This idea, though speculative, aligns with how Rome handled internal disgrace. The story of Legio III Augusta offers a partial parallel. The legion was disbanded temporarily in the 3rd century after misconduct, only to be reconstituted later. But in that case, the disbandment was recorded. The ninth leaves behind no such evidence of punishment or restoration. Its absence is so total that scholars struggle to find even a trace of its final years. There are also signs of physical erasure. Inscriptions in Roman Britain that once mentioned the ninth have been found with damage or alterations, though none conclusively prove damnatio memoriae. These could be the result of weathering, vandalism, or simple neglect. But when combined with the administrative silence, they offer circumstantial support for a deliberate act of forgetting. The absence becomes its own kind of presence. The legion's name Hispana suggests Iberian origins or service history, but no Spanish source from the period provides evidence of the unit returning to the Iberian Peninsula. Similarly, no tombstones or building inscriptions mentioning the ninth have been found in Spain, despite that being the likely region of its recruitment or original posting. A disbanded legion might leave behind veterans settling in retirement colonies, but no such settlements for the ninth have been identified. The administrative mechanism for such erasure existed within the Roman bureaucracy. Emperors could issue decrees to dissolve units, transfer survivors to other legions, and suppress information. These actions would not require wide publication. Orders could be confined to imperial archives or regional governors. The soldiers themselves might be reassigned quietly under threat of punishment for speaking about their former unit. In an age before centralized press or public accountability, control of information was practical and effective. Critics of the damnatio memoriae theory point to the absence of explicit imperial orders or statements condemning the legion. But this is part of the problem. If the erasure was effective, such documents would not survive. The argument is circular, and scholars must rely on patterns of absence rather than presence. This makes definitive conclusions impossible, but it does not invalidate the theory. In fact, it mirrors how damnatio memoriae operated by removing all traces, until speculation was the only thing left behind. The broader implications of this theory reflect on how Rome viewed failure. The empire was built on a foundation of power, permanence, and victory. To acknowledge defeat, particularly at the hands of what were seen as barbarian tribes, undermined the image of Roman invincibility. For an emperor like Hadrian, who came to power around the same time the Ninth disappeared, the need to stabilize the empire's image may have outweighed the obligation to record uncomfortable truths. The silence around the Ninth Legion likely served a purpose. News of its destruction could lower morale, hurt recruitment, or embolden enemies. Erasing the Legion helped Rome manage memory, controlling the narrative, not just forgetting. If subjected to damnatio memoriae, it would be one of few times an entire legion was erased. Whether from failure, disobedience, or defeat, the result was the same: no tombs, no honors, only a missing name in stone. The Lost Scrolls of Vindolanda. The Roman fort of Vindolanda, located just south of Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland, England, has yielded some of the most remarkable archaeological finds in Britain. Among them are the Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden sheets with ink inscriptions, often letters or military records, preserved in anaerobic soil. These fragile artifacts offer rare glimpses into the lives of Roman soldiers stationed in the northern frontier, and some of the tablets date from precisely the years when the Ninth Legion is believed to have vanished. They are not simply personal notes, they include inventories, duty rosters, and supply lists, providing a window into the bureaucracy that kept the Roman military operating in hostile territory. Excavations at Vindolanda began in earnest in the 20th century, but it was in 1973 that archaeologist Robin Burley uncovered the first group of wooden tablets buried deep in a waterlogged ditch. This preservation was accidental organic materials, usually decay in the British climate, but in this case, oxygen was prevented from reaching the wood. The earliest texts were dated to the 92nd AD, aligning them with the final decades of the Ninth Legion's known existence in Britain. This raised immediate questions. Could these documents mention the Ninth? Could they shed light on its activities or its disappearance? Some tablets reference the presence of auxiliary units, such as the first cohort of Tungrians and Batavians, and mention individuals by name: prefects, centurions, scribes. However, no definitive tablet has yet surfaced that names Legio IX Hispana directly. This absence is curious, but not necessarily proof of anything. Legions were large formations that often left their detachments, or vexillationies, at outposts like Vindolanda, while the bulk of the force remained elsewhere. If the Ninth had moved northward, deeper into what the Romans called Caledonia, their presence might not have overlapped significantly with the Vindolanda garrison at the time the tablets were written. What makes the Vindolanda texts valuable in this context is what they reveal about the fragility of Roman control in the region. References to frequent raids, supply shortages, and difficult terrain paint a picture of constant tension. Letters between commanding officers note concerns over food shipments, requests for reinforcements, and appeals for warmer clothing. The language is urgent but bureaucratic, routine but revealing. It's clear that the northern frontier, even in garrison zones like Vindolanda, was under pressure. Any legion moving further north would have faced conditions even harsher. In one tablet, a soldier complains about the lack of suitable sandals for marching through the muddy landscape. In another, a commander requests more beer. A third document, perhaps the most famous, is a birthday invitation from Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, a fellow officer's wife, written in a fine and practiced hand. These details, while seemingly mundane, anchor the Roman presence in human terms. They remind us that the Ninth, if it passed through this region, did so amid logistical uncertainty and daily discomfort. If their fate lay beyond the wall, it would not have been in a place of firm Roman control. Archaeologists continue to debate whether some of the tablets might indirectly reference the Ninth through officers or practices unique to that legion. For example, writing styles, abbreviations, or supply lists might suggest the presence of specific legions without naming them outright. Some scholars argue that certain scribal signatures and administrative formats at Vindolanda match those known from other Ninth Legion sites, but without a name, such arguments remain speculative. The possibility also exists that relevant tablets have been lost, destroyed, or remain buried, Vindolanda's anaerobic soil preserves only what was discarded in specific locations. The site has been partially excavated over decades, but many areas remain untouched, and new finds emerge nearly every season. Some of the tablets that might have referred to the ninth could still lie beneath layers of turf and stone, waiting for conditions to be just right for their recovery. Additionally, it's worth noting that Vindolanda was not officially under the 9th Legion's command. It was more likely manned by auxiliaries, with legions rotating through for specific operations. This means that even during years when the 9th was based nearby, their presence at Vindolanda may have been limited to small detachments. If such detachments did not leave behind inscriptions, or if their correspondence was never discarded in the right soil conditions, they would have passed through invisibly. Still, the Vindolanda tablets offer a rare glimpse into the military culture that the 9th would have shared. They document the meticulous record-keeping, the daily transactions of boots, cloaks, grain, and wine, and the administrative links between fort and empire. The 9th, if it perished in northern Britain, would have operated under this same system, its scribes issuing similar orders, its quartermasters counting similar supplies, and its soldiers writing similar letters home. Their story, though unwritten in ink, runs parallel to the lives captured at Vindolanda. Researchers continue to digitize and translate the Vindolanda texts, and each new interpretation adds context to the larger question of the 9th's fate. The silence surrounding the Legion in these documents is not a silence of absence, but one of missed intersection. The evidence is there, but it circles the 9th without landing directly upon it. What remains is not proof, but a boundary of possibility. Vindolanda stands as a silent witness. Its tablets whisper of a Roman world that stretched to the edge of the known, where military order met native resistance, and where a legion could vanish without the written word to mark its passing. The ghost on the tombstone. In the Dutch city of Nijmegen, once known to the Romans as Ulpia Noviomagus Batavorum, a tombstone was unearthed in the 19th century that has since raised difficult questions for historians studying the disappearance of the 9th Legion. The stone, dated to the early 2nd century AD, bears the name of Lucius Valerius Geminus, a centurion of the Legio IX Hispana. The presence of this inscription, so far from the last recorded activities of the Legion in Britain, has led to decades of speculation. What was a centurion of the 9th doing in the Rhine frontier long after the Legion had seemingly vanished? The tombstone, now housed in the Volkov Museum in Nijmegen, is typical of Roman funerary practice. It records the name of the deceased, his rank, length of service, and sometimes the circumstances of his death. Lucius Valerius Geminus is described as a centurion who served in the 9th Legion, and the stone appears to have been erected with care and official approval. This single artifact has become one of the most hotly debated pieces of evidence in the broader mystery surrounding the fate of the 9th. One explanation, favored by some historians, is that Geminus was not a survivor of a lost legion, but rather a veteran who had transferred or retired before the 9th met its end. Roman soldiers often retired to colonies or settlements far from their last battlefield. If he had completed his 25 years of service and settled in Nijmegen, his tombstone would merely reflect a life that began in Britain and ended in Germania Inferior. There is no indication on the stone of how or when he died, nor any reference to a military disaster. Yet the dating of the stone complicates matters. Based on stylistic and epigraphic analysis, the tombstone appears to date from sometime between AD 120 and 130, just after the period when the 9th disappeared from records in Britain. If Geminus had served for several decades before that date, his service would have spanned the time during which the Legion was last active in Britain. The possibility arises that Geminus was part of a fragment of the Legion that survived, either reassigned or dispersed, following a major loss. Archaeologists have scoured the region around Nijmegen for other traces of the 9th, but no other definitive inscriptions have been found. This makes the Geminus stone both valuable and problematic. A single data point does not establish a pattern. It could represent an exception, a transfer, or even an administrative error. But in the absence of clearer evidence, the silence of other tombstones only amplifies the mystery. Tombstones are not distributed evenly across Roman history or geography. The likelihood of finding one depends heavily on the burial customs of the region, the status of the individual, and the preservation of the archaeological layer in which it was deposited. Most Roman soldiers were cremated, and their ashes placed in urns, often with no durable marker at all. In other cases, tombstones were reused in later construction, broken up, or eroded beyond legibility. That Geminus's stones survived intact is as much a matter of chance as intention. Other scholars have suggested that Geminus may have been part of a detachment, what the Romans called a vexillatio, sent from Britain to reinforce legions on the Rhine. This was not uncommon. Troops were often rotated or redistributed across provinces, particularly when local unrest required additional forces. If the Ninth was weakened by conflict in Britain but not destroyed entirely, it's plausible that some of its personnel were reassigned to other legions in Germania, either individually or in groups. The fact that the Ninth Legion disappears from all official lists of Roman legions after the early 2nd century, and yet a centurion bearing its name appears on a tombstone abroad, raises the question of whether the legion was truly annihilated or simply administratively dissolved. In this scenario, the name of the legion may have been quietly retired, while its surviving officers and men were integrated into other units. The Roman Empire had a long tradition of bureaucratic erasure. Damaged reputations, failed campaigns, and political embarrassments were often handled through quiet omission rather than public reckoning. There is also the possibility that the stone has been misinterpreted. Epigraphers have debated the correct reading of the inscription. In some versions, the numeral 9 is partially eroded, leading to the suggestion that it may have been a different legion altogether. The 8th and 10th legions also operated in the area, and the similarity in numerals could lead to confusion. However, most scholarly consensus holds that the stone does indeed reference the 9th. The existence of this single tombstone does not prove or disprove any theory outright. It offers neither confirmation of survival nor evidence of destruction. Instead, it occupies a gray space between history and possibility. Geminus may have died peacefully in retirement, or he may have survived a calamity that obliterated his comrades. His stone offers no confession, no final word, only a name, a rank, and the faint outline of a story no longer told. The question of why so few similar tombstones exist remains unanswered. If more centurions or legionaries of the 9th survived, why haven't more stones appeared? Were they forbidden from commemorating their past? Did the name of the legion carry shame? Or was this simply a matter of who could afford to leave a trace behind? The ghost on the tombstone is not just Lucius Valerius Geminus. It is the legion itself, hovering behind the chiseled Latin, hidden in the cracks of imperial silence, the legion that appears nowhere else. By the year 122 AD, the Roman Empire was at its administrative peak, spanning from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania, and from the eastern reaches of Syria to the distant mist-shrouded province of Britannia. Roman legions were central to maintaining this vast control. They were carefully documented, methodically supplied, and their movements recorded with bureaucratic precision. That is why the complete disappearance of Legio IX Hispana from all official records after this period has become one of the most enduring mysteries in Roman military history. What is perhaps more perplexing than the 9th Legion's disappearance is the utter absence of the Legion's name in any future records, military, administrative, or ceremonial. No definitive trace has been found placing the 9th anywhere in the empire after their last appearance in York, around 108 AD. Unlike other legions that were destroyed in battle or disbanded for political reasons, most left behind a trail fragments of correspondence, tombstones, stamped bricks, honorific dedications, or mentions in local administrative roles. For instance, the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were lost in the Teutoburg forest under Varus in 9 AD, and their destruction was traumatic enough to be seared into both historical texts and imperial policy. Augustus himself was said to have wandered his palace halls crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But with the 9th, there is no such reaction, no dramatic lament, no ceremonial funeral, no imperial mourning. They appear in the York Fortress around 108 AD, and then they appear nowhere else. In the Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative document that lists military units and postings from the 4th and early 5th centuries, dozens of legions are accounted for. Some names are preserved long after their active service had ended, either in memory or as reorganized fragments. But there is no mention of the 9th. Even in the 3rd century writings of Cassius Dio, or the compiled lists of Ammianus Marcellinus, which make reference to legions lost, reassigned, or involved in various campaigns, the 9th is never mentioned again. Efforts to find the 9th in other provinces have yielded only silence. No inscription, altar, or veteran's tombstone from the Danube frontier, the eastern provinces, or the African provinces ever lists a soldier of Legio IX Hispana after 108 AD. This is highly unusual. Even legions that were transferred frequently leave behind evidence in the form of stamped roof tiles, amphorae handles, or altars dedicated by officers and soldiers. These traces are absent. If the 9th had been transferred intact to a different part of the empire, archaeologists would expect to find at least one such physical artifact bearing its name. But there is none. It does not appear at Lambasis in North Africa. It is not listed among the legions stationed along the Rhine or in Syria. It simply disappears. The Roman military machine did not typically erase legions without cause. The complete omission of a legion's name suggests one of two possibilities. Either the 9th was destroyed so thoroughly, and with such political sensitivity, that its name was deliberately purged from records, or it was disbanded quietly for reasons that required its identity to be erased. Damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of condemning a name to oblivion, was most commonly used against disgraced emperors or high-ranking officials, but it could theoretically be extended to a military unit if the failure was deemed catastrophic or shameful. There have been claims over the years that fragments of the 9th may have continued to serve, reassigned to other legions or auxiliary units under different banners. Some scholars have looked to partial inscriptions from the eastern provinces or the Rhine Valley that bear damaged or ambiguous references to legionary numbers. In one case, a building stone found in the Netherlands was initially thought to reference Legio IX, but further analysis suggested it may have referred to the 10th. These tenuous connections only highlight the lack of solid evidence. It is also notable that by 125 AD, Hadrian began a major restructuring of the legions in Britain, including the construction of Hadrian's Wall. A new legion, the 6th Victrix, was moved from Germania to York to replace the 9th. This move appears in the historical record without explanation, and it is the 6th that would later become the dominant force in northern Britannia. If the 9th had been relocated, such a replacement would not have been necessary. The silence regarding the 9th's fate, coupled with the sudden arrival of a new legion in its old fortress, suggests that the 9th was removed not through relocation, but through extinction or disbandment. The loss of a Roman legion was not unprecedented, but the lack of any mention, inscription, or record following its disappearance is without parallel. Even the disgraced legions after Teutoburg had their names remembered. The 9th's name was not only omitted, but seemingly scrubbed from institutional memory. That silence cannot be accidental. The question historians continue to grapple with is, why? If the 9th had been annihilated in Britain, why no record of it? If it had mutinied or disgraced itself, why no condemnation or trial? If it had been transferred, why no trace? The fact that it appears nowhere else in the East, Africa, or along the Rhine creates a vacuum that resists explanation. It is this total absence that makes the 9th unique. It is not merely a lost legion. It is a legion that was allowed to vanish, not just from the battlefield, but from history itself. The seal that was broken, imperial cover-up. In the mid-2nd century, an unusual shift began to take shape within the bureaucratic records of the Roman Empire. While other legions were regularly accounted for in imperial ledgers, dispatches, and ceremonial inscriptions, one remained conspicuously missing: Legio IX Hispana. For those managing the immense machinery of Rome's military structure, this was not a simple oversight. Records were the lifeblood of control. The absence of documentation wasn't merely a lapse, it was a decision. The disappearance of the ninth, without explanation or aftermath, has led many modern historians to consider whether its erasure was intentional, coordinated, and enforced from the highest levels of imperial authority. To understand the possibility of a cover-up, one must consider the broader political context. During the early 122nd AD, Emperor Hadrian had just come to power. Known for consolidating rather than expanding the empire, Hadrian was a pragmatic ruler who sought to restore stability after the aggressive campaigns of his predecessor, Trajan. When Hadrian visited Britannia around 122 AD, he ordered the construction of a massive defensive structure, the wall that would bear his name. This monumental project was not just a response to northern unrest, it was also an administrative reset. The timing of Hadrian's visit coincides closely with the disappearance of the ninth and the sudden arrival of a new legion, the 6th Victrix, from Germania. The replacement of a legion without documentation or commemoration is virtually unprecedented. The absence of any imperial decree, senatorial mention, or funerary record related to the ninth's demise suggests not only that it was gone, but that someone had taken steps to prevent people from asking why. This form of silence points to the deliberate breaking of the seal and interruption of the official historical record, sanctioned or enforced by imperial will. The Roman Empire was no stranger to manipulating records. Damnatio memoriae, while most famously used against emperors, could be applied to anyone or anything considered a stain on Rome's honor. While there is no direct evidence that this legal condemnation was imposed on Legio IX Hispana, the outcome is strikingly similar. In the wake of political embarrassment or strategic failure, Rome often sought to control the narrative. To erase the ninth from scrolls, from dedications, from the words of historians, would have required influence at the very top. Military failures were often preserved as lessons or warnings, but some may have posed too great a risk to imperial prestige. If the ninth had been wiped out in Britain by local tribes, perhaps in a brutal ambush deep in Caledonian territory, such a loss could have been perceived as weakness. Hadrian's wall itself was a message. Rome's reach had limits, but to admit that a full legion had been annihilated beyond the frontier may have risked unrest or further rebellion. Instead, the memory of the ninth was simply withdrawn. The seal, in this case, was not a wax impression or metal clasp, but a historical boundary, the decision to prevent the story from being written at all. Internal documents, military transfers, casualty reports, and promotions may have existed in temporary form, stored in forts like Eboracum, modern-day York, or in provincial headquarters. But if any such papers recorded the fate of the ninth, they are gone. No dispatch from a governor, no letter to the Senate, no inscription marking their service survives. The only known mentions end before 120 AD. Even the arrival of the 6th Victrix was accompanied by remarkable administrative silence. Normally, the reassignment of a legion involved months of preparation and considerable documentation records that would often survive in fragments. Yet in this case, it appears as though the 6th simply appears in York with little fanfare. Such a transition would have required imperial approval, and yet it left behind no explanation. That absence suggests a purposeful overwriting of history. Historians have long debated whether the ninth's fate was simply forgotten over time, or whether it was buried deliberately. The idea of an imperial cover-up emerged more forcefully in the 20th century, as researchers noted the glaring contradictions between Rome's typical record-keeping and the ninth's vanishing. The theory gained ground not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't: no mosaics, no altars, no surviving administrative scrolls, and no later histories that dared to question the silence. The Vindolanda tablets, some of the most important archaeological finds from Roman Britain, include letters and military records dating to the early 2nd century. Yet even among these documents covering supply requests, leave permissions, and unit deployments, there is no reference to Legio IX Hispana after 108 AD. This supports the idea that the erasure was systemic, extending even into daily bureaucratic practices. The legion wasn't merely gone, it had been removed from the ledger. Rome understood the power of narrative. Emperors immortalized victories in stone, but the Ninth Legion's absence suggests memory was also used as control. A force of 5,000 couldn't vanish unnoticed unless deliberately erased. Soldiers may have been reassigned with altered records, mass deaths left unmarked, or desertions silenced to prevent future unrest and maintain Rome's image of strength and order. Silence, in this case, became a calculated tool of empire. By the end of Hadrian's reign in 138 AD, the history of the Ninth had already begun to fade. Their banner, once a symbol of conquest in Hispania and valor in Germania, no longer flew anywhere in the empire. Without commemoration, without mourning, without a final campaign or epitaph, the Ninth had ceased to exist not only in military terms, but in memory itself. This erasure is its own kind of legacy. Not every battle ends with a record. Some disappear behind a curtain drawn by those in power. The other missing legions. The disappearance of Legio IX Hispana has drawn intense attention because of its complete absence from the historical record, but it was not the only Roman legion to vanish or be removed from official rolls. At various points throughout Rome's history, other legions also ceased to exist, some through known defeats, others through political dissolution, and still others under circumstances that remain uncertain. Comparing the fate of the Ninth to these other missing legions provides insight into how Rome managed, recorded, or concealed its military losses, and helps place the Ninth within a broader pattern of imperial strategy and historical control. One of the most famous cases of military annihilation was the disaster at the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. In this catastrophic ambush, 3 Roman legions, Legio XVII, XVIII, and XVIII, were led by Publius Quinctilius Varus into a trap laid by the Germanic chieftain Arminius. Over the course of several days, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered in the forests of Germania. The event caused immense shock across the empire. Emperor Augustus, reportedly devastated, entered a prolonged period of mourning. He is said to have banged his head against a wall in grief, repeatedly crying out for Varus to return his legions. The losses were acknowledged publicly, and the legion numbers 17, 17, and 11 were retired and never reused, perhaps out of a mixture of reverence and shame. However, their memory was not erased. Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and other sources preserve the details, and archaeological evidence continues to confirm the event. A different example occurred in the late 3rd century during the reign of Emperor Gallienus, when a series of military crises and internal rebellions led to widespread restructuring of the Roman army. During this time, several legions were either split into smaller units or absorbed into newly created forces. Legions like the Extation Deotariana, known to be stationed in Egypt, also vanish from records during this period. While some historians believe the 22 may have been destroyed during the Jewish revolt in 119 AD, others suggest administrative reorganization may have caused its dissolution. However, even with the uncertainty, there are fragmentary inscriptions, coins, and papyri that continue to reference these legions long after they stopped operating as unified units. In contrast, the Ninth Legion leaves no such trail. Another case is that of Legio III Augusta, which operated in North Africa for centuries. In 238 AD, the legion was disbanded following its involvement in a revolt against Emperor Gordian III. Yet, despite its official termination, the Third Augusta remained part of Rome's military memory. Veterans were buried with tombstones referencing the legion, and in the 252nd, the legion was reconstituted and returned to its African base. This cycle of removal and revival was not uncommon in the Roman world, but it demonstrates that even disgraced or politically problematic units were rarely expunged from memory in the way the Ninth appears to have been. One proposed comparison to the fate of the Ninth is the disappearance of certain auxiliary units. These support troops, often recruited from non-citizen populations in the provinces, sometimes received less attention in the historical record. When auxiliary cohorts were destroyed or disbanded, they were more likely to vanish quietly due to their lower status in the Roman military hierarchy. But even in these cases, occasional tombstones, tile stamps, or inscriptions survive to confirm their existence. The silence surrounding the ninth, a full legion with a storied history, remains exceptional. The case of Legio 22 Deotariana is especially relevant. It too disappears from the record with minimal documentation. Some believe it may have been lost during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea between 132 and 136 AD, a violent uprising that inflicted significant casualties on Roman forces. However, the hypothesis remains debated, and while the details of the 22's disappearance are murky, scholars continue to debate the available archaeological and literary evidence. In contrast, the ninth's disappearance predates the Bar Kokhba revolt and offers even less material for analysis. It is as though a conscious effort was made to prevent any mention of the legion's fate, suggesting a deeper political motivation. A comparison can also be made to the Parthian and Sasanian conflicts of the East. During these border wars, several legions suffered heavy losses. In 260 AD, for instance, Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persians and his army largely destroyed. Even in this humiliating episode, however, the legion names and events were preserved by Roman and foreign chroniclers alike. The humiliation was not erased, and memory remained intact. This further highlights the uniqueness of the ninth's erasure. Its absence is not merely unexplained, it is unacknowledged. What emerges from examining these other cases is a pattern. Roman legions, even when lost, typically left behind evidence. Whether in the form of epitaphs, commemorations, reorganized formations, or literary references, their existence was rarely denied. The ninth breaks this pattern. Its complete omission from both administrative and archaeological records after 108 AD, combined with the unusual lack of commentary from contemporaries, marks it as an anomaly. Other missing legions may have been destroyed or dissolved, but they were not hidden. The unusual silence surrounding the ninth raises questions. Was its loss so shameful or politically damaging it had to be erased? Did it involve mutiny, betrayal, or a failure implicating Rome's elite? Or did it perish where no survivors remained? Though other legions faced defeat, none of similar stature vanished so completely. In Rome's long tradition of military record-keeping, the ninth stands alone, erased, with a level of silence unmatched in imperial history. Celtic echoes and forbidden songs. Long after the Ninth Legion vanished from official Roman records, whispers of its fate seemed to persist in places where parchment could not reach, and Latin inscriptions did not endure. Among the oral traditions of northern Britain, especially within the highlands and borderlands of Scotland, fragments of song, story, and lament echo faint memories of a Roman force that came but did not return. These are not firm historical records in the conventional sense. They are poems without authors, refrains without dates, cultural residue that, for some historians, might offer a shadowy glimpse into events that formal Roman history refused to preserve. Among the earliest suggestions of such echoes comes from the Scottish lowlands, where later medieval ballads reference the Red Marchers, or ghost men from the south. These figures are often described in contrast to the native tribes, disciplined, armored, and silent. Some of the verses tell of a great battle beyond the wall, where a host of strangers were cut down to the last man, and none rode home. The language is metaphorical and shaped by centuries of oral retelling, but the imagery bears an unmistakable resemblance to a Roman military column destroyed in enemy territory. One particular source of interest is the 13th century compilation known as the Glenmore Chronicles, a manuscript derived from older oral traditions gathered by clerics in the region of Galloway. Though mostly concerned with Christian legends, it includes a passage describing a vanished host who brought thunder and iron, but were swallowed by the hills. While the reference is ambiguous, its tone suggests a sense of awe and trauma associated with the incursion and loss of a foreign force. Folk memory tends to preserve moments of rupture, events so devastating or unexpected that they leave an imprint on communal consciousness. The complete destruction of a Roman legion, if witnessed by local tribes, would qualify as such a moment. For people whose history was not written in scrolls, but passed from mouth to mouth, song and myth became the primary tools of preservation. The transformation of fact into legend was not a distortion, but a means of survival. There are also references from the Pictish oral tradition that have drawn modern attention. In stories collected during the 18th century from the Orkney and Shetland Islands, far from Roman military roads, tales persist of the strangers from the south, who angered the gods and were taken beneath the earth. It is possible these stories absorbed Christian eschatology, or later Norse mythology. The root imagery of a vanished southern force has caused some scholars to wonder whether they represent a cultural echo of the Ninth's final march. Not all references are sympathetic. In some northern legends, the Roman soldiers are depicted as invaders cursed for desecrating sacred ground. One Highland tale recounts a battlefield near a standing stone circle where the Iron Men were surrounded by mist and never seen again. This blend of natural landscape and supernatural disappearance may seem fanciful, but it reflects a memory of encroachment, met with violent resistance and sudden erasure. The song itself, recorded by Scottish folklorist Alexander Carmichael in the 19th century, was attributed to a local bardic tradition believed to date back centuries. Another unusual source is a Welsh medieval poem attributed to Taliesin, the 6th century bard, whose works blend myth with history. In one passage, he refers to the men who came with shining thighs, 5,000 strong, who vanished like foam on the sea. While Taliesin's poems often employ metaphor and magical imagery, the phrase 5,000 has led some interpreters to speculate whether this is a poetic memory of the Ninth Legion, filtered through centuries of retelling and geographical distortion. Wales was part of Roman Britain, and stories could have traveled along ancient roads and among displaced tribes. Oral traditions often defy verification, yet their persistence across regions and generations suggests an event too large to ignore, even if official records were lost or suppressed. While no archaeological site has confirmed the final resting place of the Ninth, the folklore that lingers in the cultural memory of Britain suggests that something catastrophic occurred, something that struck the native peoples so powerfully that they embedded it in their songs and stories long after Rome had turned its gaze elsewhere. Modern scholars, such as Linda Evans and Thomas Green, have studied the relationship between Roman military campaigns and Celtic folklore, arguing that the transformation of legionary disaster into legend follows a familiar anthropological pattern. Similar processes have been documented in other colonized societies, where indigenous oral tradition preserves the outline of traumatic events that imperial records omit. In these cases, folklore is not a mirror of history, but a shadow warped in shape, but anchored in substance. The absence of tombstones, monuments, or inscriptions marking the end of Legio IX Hispana in Roman sources is striking. But in the songs of the North, in chants passed down through generations, there is the faint echo of an ending that was never written down. Whether these traditions refer specifically to the Ninth or to other encounters with Roman power, their thematic consistency of a powerful southern force destroyed and forgotten continues to fuel theories that something devastating occurred far from the eyes of the scribes. Such stories often exist on the margins of academic inquiry. They are considered unreliable, unverifiable, or too entangled with myth to serve as historical evidence. But in the case of the Ninth, where the silence of formal history is so complete, even folklore becomes a source worth examining. The songs may not tell us exactly where or how the Ninth fell, but they suggest that someone remembered it, even when Rome did not. The Temple of Mithras and the Vanishing Oath. In the shadowed ruins beneath modern-day London, archaeologists uncovered one of the most enigmatic sites associated with Roman Britain, the Temple of Mithras, first unearthed in 1954 during construction near Walbrook Street. Among the fragments of altars, statues, and votive offerings lay silent witnesses to a mystery that continues to baffle historians. The cult of Mithras, widespread among Roman soldiers during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, was secretive by design. And it is within this secrecy that some believe lies a missing thread of the Ninth Legion's fate, lost not only in battle, but in ritual, in loyalty, and perhaps in silence willingly kept. Mithraism was not a religion of the common Roman citizen. It thrived especially among legionaries, centurions, and elite officers. Its rites were conducted underground, often in cavernous rooms meant to mimic the cave where Mithras was said to have slain the sacred bull. Initiation involved 7 grades of progression, each symbolic of a cosmic ascent, and included complex oaths of secrecy. No public texts remain from within the cult. What we know comes from iconography and scattered inscriptions. This silence was not incidental. It was central to the structure of belief. At Eboracum, modern-day York, the 9th Legion was stationed during the early 2nd century AD, with records placing them there until at least 108 AD. It is in York that one of the earliest Mithraic temples in Britain may have existed, although most remains have been destroyed or buried by later construction. Artifacts linked to Mithras, including carved reliefs and altars, have been recovered in sites associated with Roman military forts throughout the northern frontier. The cult spread coincides almost perfectly with the movement and locations of Roman legions, suggesting that it formed a powerful internal network, one bound not just by military hierarchy, but by spiritual allegiance. Some scholars propose that the 9th Legion was deeply embedded in this Mithraic structure. The secrecy surrounding the cult would have created a parallel system of loyalty, one less visible to outsiders, and perhaps more binding than oaths to emperor or senate. In a context where Roman soldiers regularly transferred allegiance from one commander to another, the spiritual bonds of Mithraism may have provided a deeper, more personal sense of unity. This has led to theories still speculative that the 9th may have undertaken a final mission under religious orders, or that their disappearance involved a Mithraic vow that required silence, even in death. At Caroburg, a fort along Hadrian's Wall, the remains of a Mithraeum were found with 3 altars dedicated by commanders of the first cohort of Batavians. While the 9th is not directly named, the Batavians often fought alongside them in Britain. This suggests the spiritual atmosphere among auxiliary and legionary troops was shared, and possibly coordinated. If Mithraic initiation rituals were held here before northern campaigns, it raises the possibility that the 9th's final actions were shaped by this religious context. Whether they faced annihilation, betrayal, or voluntary disappearance, the culture of silence might explain the total lack of contemporary record. Another angle comes from the known practice of damnatio memoriae, Rome's formal erasure of people or units from public memory. While this political tool was used in cases of disgrace or treason, its effectiveness relied on removing monuments, inscriptions, and public honors. For a religious cult like Mithraism, which operated without permanent temples or open documentation, no such physical erasure was necessary. The oath of secrecy itself acted as a form of voluntary damnatio. Initiates were bound never to speak of what they saw, heard, or did within the cult. If the 9th Legion's final campaign was wrapped in such ritual, it would explain why even surviving members, if there were any, left no account. The Mithraic connection becomes more intriguing when considered alongside the broader imperial strategy. The Emperor Hadrian, who visited Britain in 122 AD and initiated the construction of Hadrian's Wall, was aware of the unrest in the northern territories. If the 9th had been sent north in 108 AD to quell a revolt or suppress hostile tribes, and if they were acting under Mithraic leadership or coordination, it is possible that their fate became a state secret. A failed campaign under religious auspices would have been deeply embarrassing, particularly if it ended in betrayal, desertion, or massacre. At Vindolanda, tablets written by Roman officers reveal the mundane yet revealing details of daily military life rations, troop movements, personal letters. One document refers obliquely to those who failed to return from the march, but without naming a unit. It's possible that Mithraic silence extended even to routine correspondence, omitting details that might expose the activities of initiates. The absence of records, then, may not be a matter of loss, but of deliberate omission. Today, reconstructions of Mithraic temples show the same recurring imagery: Mithras slaying the bull, flanked by torchbearers Cautes and Cautopetes, with zodiac symbols surrounding the central act. The scene is believed to symbolize the creation of life through sacrifice. If the 9th Legion believed they were acting within this cosmic drama, their disappearance might have been interpreted not as failure, but as fulfillment, a necessary vanishing in service of a higher, secret cause. The Temple of Mithras in London, meticulously reconstructed at its original subterranean level, stands as a quiet testament to how much we still don't know. No scrolls remain, no eyewitness accounts, only stone, carved symbols, and altars left behind by those who pledged never to explain them. In the story of the Ninth Legion, this spiritual silence may be the loudest clue. The fate of the Ninth Legion remains shrouded in silence, swallowed by time, lost to history. Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath our feet, or hidden in scrolls yet to be found. Until then, their march echoes only in legend. If you enjoyed uncovering this mystery with us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories where history and mystery collide.